Ciao guys, this is the Jade Palace, a channel where we try to look at modern martial arts from the point of view of traditional martial arts. In one of the first videos on my channel, I've addressed a popular misconception on the topic of mixing different martial arts. To quickly sum it up, there is this rather nonsensical upon closer look, yet weirdly widespread meme that the genius idea of taking two or more distinct styles and combining them to get something better just, apparently never occurred to anyone throughout all the millennia of our civilization, until our Lord and Savior Bruce Lee came along to bring his revelation. And by the way, I'm not making fun of Bruce Lee, because I have a lot of respect for the guy. It's only the more fanatical of his cultists that deserve ridicule. Anyway, there's a competing church preaching that whatever Bruce Lee was or wasn't, and there are rival sects inside this one on the question of Bruce Lee as an earlier prophet. But their view is that the final grace that we should worship was given to mankind in 1993 in the form of Ultimate Fighting Championship Tournament. That is when a unique and previously absolutely unfathomable idea that you can add 2 and 2 together to get 4 was finally embraced by the feeble human mind, and the age of darkness was finally over. And yeah, upon rational analysis, this narrative makes just as much sense as any other holy scripture, but hey, you're not supposed to question the fate. Forget about the fact that clashing and mixing of different schools of thought were one of the main engines for progress in science, medicine, engineering, art, culture, as long as those things existed. This just wasn't the case for martial arts, at least not according to the symbol of fate. Forget that the progress of human ingenuity by that point included feats like splitting the atom or sending people into space. Apparently, the concept of taking a couple of technical moves here and there and putting them together to form a more well-rounded skill set, that concept is much more sophisticated one that humanity just wasn't prepared for until then. Yeah, sorry, definitely went on a tangent there, but it just drives me bananas how many people keep repeating such an obviously silly tale without ever questioning it. Anyways, even as I make fun of this narrative, and I hope I was able to show you earlier, it's not some brand new never before seen thing that pops into existence out of the void in the late 20th century, but rather simply a new twist on an age-old idea. I think it would be also fair to say that this modern iteration of style mixing, spearheaded by the sport of MMA, has its own flavor that's somewhat different from what we see in traditional martial arts. So what is that difference? And is it for the better or for the worse? So, the main trope for this kind of tale in martial arts history goes something like this. There lived a guy, he learned a style, then another one, sometimes there's also a third or a whole bunch of them. As he progressed in his martial arts experience, he started seeing more and more similarities between those different schools and was able to crystallize the essence, the unified and universal foundation behind all of them, and combine them into a style of his own. As you can see, in this type of story, it's the similarities between the styles that are key, and the differences are seen more as dressing garbs or different flavored icings on the cake. Now, for contrast, let's look at the development of modern sport of MMA. Its roots lie in what was called the Gracie Challenge, the practice that the famous Brazilian family adopted since the early 20th century, where they would sometimes politely invite and at other occasions rudely dojo storm or even outright attack representatives of other martial arts to prove their family system's superiority. This trend culminated in the original Ultimate Fighting Championship Tournament, an event that was promoted as an inter-style competition, officially to find out which martial arts school is the strongest, although by many accounts it had been deliberately set up to show Gracie BJJ domination to a wide audience. And though today some like to equate the UFC brand with the discipline of MMA itself, and view the first few UFC tournaments as its origin, parallel to them a number of other organizations around the globe were doing their part for the development of an infant sport with different levels of BJJ involvement. Whatever was the specific style, however, whether it was judo, sambo, catch wrestling, what those first tournaments clearly shown was that in a clash of one-dimensional arts, a pure grappler triumphs over a pure striker 9 times out of 10. Which wasn't necessarily common wisdom either back in the day. Experienced martial artists might have been aware of it, but if you'd poll random people on the street on the idea of a striker versus grappler fight, most would probably have told you a boxer or a karateka can be expected to knock out a wrestler coming in. And yet, as much of a revelation this was for the general public, it still wasn't really about mixing at this point, more just introducing the value of grappling and ground game into the popular discourse. It took the second generation, the Tito Ortizes and Chuck Liddells and Matt Hugheses, to really bring home the crucial importance of well-roundedness. And mind you, back then, a very rudimental version of well-roundedness that mostly consisted of combining boxing with wrestling, but it was the first step. From there, the canon of MMA philosophy was formed, and I think comprehensively introduced to a wider audience on the first season of The Ultimate Fighter show, when Randy Couture explained their training facility and evaluation schedule as consisting of several main areas: boxing, Muay Thai and grappling, with the fourth section being strength and conditioning. The idea was, each of those disciplines provided you with a toolkit to cover what they saw as main ranges or types of engagement in a fight: striking at distance and in the clinch, grappling on the feet and on the ground. Since then, of course, more arts and elements entered the equation, and this three-piece set will look somewhat primitive to modern MMA fighters who throw spinning back or tornado kicks as if they're jabs, yet the foundational philosophy still remains the same. For each range and type of fighting, you go to a system that specializes on it and borrow from them, be it rotation-based throws from judo, kicks to the body and head from taekwondo, etc. I think at this point you've noticed the difference between the two approaches to mixing. The old school idea is, first and foremost, look at the fundamental principles that unite and unify different styles. Look at the common denominator, cause that should be the source of their power. Modern concept is more of the opposite. Pay attention to the differences between the arts, since that will show the holes in each of their arsenals. And then you can complement one with another to make your fighting toolkit more versatile. And yes, of course the two approaches are not necessarily mutually exclusive, it's simply a question of putting more emphasis on one or the other. Are you more of a multi-tool person, or do you prefer specialization in a number of separate things? As far as the sources for the difference, my guess for the main one is the nature of sports in general and combat sports specifically. And I mean older combat sports before the modern era of mixing, so things like classic boxing and wrestling, as far as their tendency to emphasize and specialize in one area. So then by the point they come together in one arena like that, you have to combine them to make up for that one-dimensionality of each separately. And of course the moment I say that, I realize there's a chorus of angry voices yelling, "This is BS, traditional martial arts were part of the early MMA as well and proved to be just as one-dimensional and got obliterated for it." Yeah, about that. Sorry to bring it to you guys, but this popular story is actually not true on multiple levels that each demand a separate video to break down, so I can sure promise you those are already in the works. But for now, let's go back to the original question of whether this modern idea of mixing is advantageous or is it a step backwards. What do you think? Kindly share your thoughts in the comments. Personally, I will submit to you that I see an argument for both. As far as the plus side, well, this story has been told a million times, and at this point anyone who knows anything about MMA is able to recite it, but I guess it's just good manners to shortly sum it up for those viewers who might be new to martial arts period, and also simply to have both sides on a table to make the comparison more ostensive. Basically, it's the idea that you often won't be as good as your opponent at their area of expertise, but you won't have to as long as you can introduce them to a completely different puzzle they have no solution for. You only need to be good enough in their field to keep them at bay for a short time while preparing your own trap. There's an infinite number of examples for that, both in the early MMA. In fact, any strategically complex sport, MMA just makes it most obvious. And also infinite examples on the regional and amateur scene. But allow me the pleasure of going to my personal favorite, which is Holly Holm vs Ronda Rousey. It's my fave for many reasons actually, but as far as this particular topic is concerned, is because Rousey was the last ever one-trick pony at the highest level of the sport, and she was able to get away with it due to A, sure, being incredibly good at that one trick, but also B, being a part of the women's MMA introduction to the big scene. Big scene is important here, because once you get to that, there's money, which in its turn means a pool of people who can make a living by dedicating 100% of their time and effort to becoming the best. Enter Holly Holm, multiple times world boxing and kickboxing champion, but also a protege of Greg Jackson, one of the cornerstone MMA masterminds back at that era, training at a gym full of top-level experts in different parts of MMA game. Both unfortunately not the case anymore, but that's a sad story for another day. Meaning, Holly is a great example of a fighter who also leans heavily on one very particular forte of hers, kickboxing in her case, but also has competent enough basics of the opponent's game, grappling, to withstand their initial onslaught, while slowly but surely chipping at her confidence with strikes. I don't know that it gets any more textbook than this. That's your modern concept of martial arts mixing in a nutshell, and at its best. Okay, we got the common wisdom on the table, we reminded ourselves one more time about the strength of core MMA philosophy. But what is the potential weakness though? And what is it that traditional martial arts specifically can offer that this approach lacks? Well, if you think about how systems evolve, and I mean pretty much any systems in the world, technological, biological, societal, cultural, martial arts being no exception, they always inevitably tend to concentrate around a certain core and grow in specificity to support it. So the first most simple and obvious layer is just MMA being a very young phenomenon that didn't yet have the time to build such a system. And I'm sure at this point many will object, no, but it has a rich legacy, it combines the best practices that were already proven before in all those other arts it incorporated. Right, precisely my point. That's not necessarily a strength. In fact, that's kind of its main problem. You already have all those systems that evolved for generations in different environments, refining their methods under different conditions for different goals. You cannot just slap it all together with duct tape and pretend those opposites belong together, no more than sewing together a pair of bird's wings, cheetah legs and shark fins would make a creature that's the best flyer, runner and swimmer. I have no doubt MMA will evolve into a more cohesive thing of its own as well given time. But at this stage it still is a little bit of a Frankenstein's monster, put together from parts of different bodies that don't necessarily fit. You have methodologies that want to move you in not just different but sometimes opposite directions. That is where traditional martial arts come in. See, because those historic schools evolved for application outside of sport arenas and were used in the times when melee combat defined survival, it was never an option for them to limit themselves to one narrow area. Saying we will only punch, or kick, or wrestle, everything else is out of bounds, and then perfecting your skill set to match these conditions is a luxury you can only afford in an artificially constructed competition. Once again, I'm walking on thin ice here, being perfectly aware of any number of standard objections by people of, let's say, different levels of familiarity with actual traditional styles. Wait, but what about Taekwondo, what about Wing Chun, what about this and that, apparently not fitting your story. And again, for now yours truly can only promise you to definitely make separate videos in future on each of those classic must-visit landmark topics of martial arts YouTube. In fact, those are also already on the assembly line in my little workshop. But right now, I want to draw your attention to this. Whatever else you might think of traditional styles, these are systems that develop for decades and sometimes centuries under the logic of not having clear separation between grappling, striking, or even hacking and slashing at each other with the full arsenal of cold steel. Which means the very same laws of natural selection and evolution that moved something like boxing and something like Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu to the polar ends of martial arts spectrum, the same laws did the opposite for traditional styles, fusing everything together, forming those fundamental philosophies and methodologies that make every move, whether it's a punch, kick, block, throw, joint lock, blade stab, what have you, to make it work under the common set of fundamental body mechanics. There is this other idea that have been gathering popularity in the later years, that the best path is first building a strong core of fighting skills in combat sports and then treating elements from traditional schools like rare collectibles to add for additional flavor. And that just comes from misunderstanding what tradition is to begin with. Maybe it is a good approach towards something that just uses the looks and aesthetics of tradition while being in its heart of hearts an actual modern combat sport through and through. Looking at you, Taekwondo, or Thin Blood offspring that have been watered down and lost connection to their lineage so much they have nothing more to offer at this point apart from a few circus tricks. But if we're talking real authentic schools, I would suggest the exact opposite. They are at their strongest for building a solid base, and then you have unlimited freedom to add whatever fancy schmancy technical moves from all walks of combat sports world you like, if you're still interested at that point. That is what I saw and tried to share with you in the George St-Pierre style breakdown. Links are below if you haven't seen it yet. Which is, when you think of it, almost ironic. I mean, his base is Kyokushin karate, a rather one-dimensional combat sport, and yet even having those half-dormant genes and atavistic elements from its historical roots clearly shows. Alongside with his gymnastics, by the way. And how about breakdancing or yoga, things that Joe Rogan and Eddie Bravo never tire to praise as a huge help for BJJ practice? How about things as far removed from martial arts as ballet or improvisational jazz dance? All those things can also be incredibly beneficial. Cause in the end, it's not about specific techniques. Sure, you need the moves, you need an actual arsenal to throw at your opponent in a fight. But techniques don't work by themselves. What makes them work is fundamental culture of operating your body, of moving it through space with power, balance, precision, control, timing. Building that culture is what traditional martial arts excel at. Add on top of that the fact that, unlike dancing or yoga, martial arts methods like Neigon or Taolo specifically did develop to refine those qualities and skills for combat, and now you have an idea why those can work as a great foundation for whatever technical arsenal you put on top. So basically that's what happened. Traditional schools have been medieval craftsmen workshops, building complete mechanisms with a holistic approach as their main source of quality. Then the modern systems came in as an industrial era assembly line factories, and their claim to fame was, you know how those old folks have one guy responsible for the whole process? Well, we've optimized it. In our conveyor pipeline there is a specialist for each element separately, so we've polished and perfected every part. At which point we as traditional stylists go, great, good for you guys. But wait a minute, don't you notice that in your polishing and perfecting process you were actually grinding off some key details and deforming the parts to the point that now they don't necessarily go together that well? And here you go, two kinds of martial arts mixing for you in a nutshell. The modern sports one, based on compensating for one art's weaknesses with another's strength, and the traditional one, for centuries fusing different elements of its arsenal into a unified alloy, following common principles for every action. Which one do you personally find more appealing? Share in the comments. Even as I don't make any secret of my personal preference and the fact that I'm a Kung Fu fan through and through, my goal here is not to tell you to choose one thing over the rest, but rather to inform you so that you can make your own educated choices. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this, kindly project your chi towards the like and subscribe buttons. Also, You know by now that yours truly is on a mission to educate people and dispel myths about traditional martial arts, so if you think it's a noble cause and want to participate, there is no better way than to share this on your social media. And if you're seriously committed, you can even become a supporter of the channel. Which, by the way, also allows you to watch original, less heavily edited cuts. Finally, and most importantly, if you want to come and learn Kung Fu with us, all the links to the school are below. And remember,
style is a crystallization, I mean, that way it's a process of continuing growth.